What the heck is this, algebra?
Well, I hope it's not algebra because I haven't flunked it yet.
Me either.
It's more like geometry.
What?
What? Okay, so 1/2 of number 1 gauge equals S gauge.
Okay.
See, it's sort of more like geometry.
Oh.
Okay. So we need to sort of recap where we started way back when we first started doing these scales and gauges thing.
A little review work here.
A little review work. So back in the 1890s, when there was the first attempt to standardize scales and gauges, the Society of Model Engineers decreed 6 different gauges and scales. O gauge, which back then was 0 gauge or not gauge in the British vernacular, 1 gauge, and then I'm mentioning 2 gauge here because there's this weird confusion. Back when we first mentioned this, I said I had no idea why they standardized 2 gauge because it just didn't fit anywhere. 2 gauge at 2 inches didn't line up with any known scales or anything. Well, I found out the reason is because Markland was already using it.
I see.
And Lionel adopted it sort of, and they called it standard gauge, but the Lionel version of it was 2 1/8 inches.
Oh my.
And the reason I mention it is for some reason people are getting confused thinking that standard gauge is S gauge. I guess because they both have an S in them.
They start with S.
They start with S. No, there's no relationship there whatsoever.
Well, it figures. It's like algebra.
It is like algebra, isn't it? So again, back in the 1890s, another interesting thing that happened is people got the idea to take number 1 gauge and simply divide it in half, making it 1/64 scale or 3/16 inch to the foot scale. But there's no way back then to build model trains in that small size. But they were building static models in that size.
Static models?
Yeah, just display models out of cardstock and wood.
Well, yeah.
Not static as in electricity.
Cling. Shocking.
Yeah, I hope not. Anyway, another thing that happened in the earlier days, 1922, Bing of Nuremberg decided to divide O scale or naught scale in half to create double aught or HO in America. HO scale.
Oh boy.
That early, 1922.
1922.
But it's another one of these half scales by taking O scale and dividing that in half.
Wouldn't that be C?
Yeah, I see. Okay, let's move the clock forward, or the calendar really, just a bit to the 1930s and 40s. CD Models and Chicago Flyer released what they called S-scale trains, or S-gauge trains. So these were trains in that scale and gauge, 3/16 inches to the foot, or 1/2 of number 1 gauge. Now at approximately that same time, 1939, A.C. Gilbert released trains in 3/16 inch scale, but they designed them to run on 3-rail O gauge track. And they did that because they were already making O gauge 3-rail track and they just didn't want to retool. Okay, at this point, we have to take a break for World War II.
Okay.
And then after the war, A.C. Gilbert bought out Chicago Flyer and bought up all their tooling and models and everything and re-released them as American Flyer.
Oh.
And this is finally the S-gauge / S-scale that we're all so familiar with.
Okay.
When you say S-scale or S-gauge, most people automatically think American Flyer. But it was actually sort of a long time coming. And it was popular enough that it competed nicely with Lionel, although Lionel and O-gauge still pretty much owned the market. But interestingly, some of the companies like Plasticville here released their models halfway between the two, saying, well, that way they'll work with either O scale or S scale.
Well, there you go.
Kind of a cheat. At any rate, American Flyer trains were around for a while, then they were gone. But later on in 1979, Lionel bought up the rights to the name American Flyer and brought back S-gauge trains. And also in 1979, a new company formed, American Models, trying to capitalize on the name American Flyer. But American Models here, if you notice, look very much like HO gauge or scale trains. The track is almost indistinguishable from Atlas track.
Exactly.
You'd never guess that this is S, but it is in fact S scale, S gauge, and you can run the old original American Flyer trains on it as well. Okay, now we need to fire up our time machine again and go back to the middle of World War II. Even though no one was building models at the time, that didn't stop the NMRA, the National Model Railroad Association, from standardizing S scale and S gauge and creating a whole set of fine scale standards just for S. And that led to the creation of all kinds of fine scale brass models, craftsman models, and that sort of thing. And we've seen these before. This is John Pratt's collection. He's one of the few people around that does fine scale S scale or S gauge trains in standard gauge.
The craftsman kit basically was a pile of lumber.
And the NMRA created narrow gauge variations on S scale, SN3 and SN2. And SN3 has become really popular with a group of very, very fine scale modelers. This is Doug Jolly's railroad.
Isn't that beautiful?
Ah, SN3, beautiful railroad. And then we also saw Gil Bennett's railroad.
Right.
Also SN3. And the Europeans have also created a set of standards, the NEM10 standards, and one of the most popular gauges here is meter gauge,
Oh,
SM.
SM, okay.
And the advantage there is it's exactly correct when running on HO gauge track.
Oh, that's handy.
So isn't that handy?
Yes.
Well, anyway, there you go. S scale, S gauge. One of these interesting half scales by taking an existing scale and simply dividing it in half.
Oh, boy.
Well, if you're not a subscriber to the channel, or better yet, maybe a member, you can simply become a subscriber by hitting the blue button. Doesn't cost anything. Just click on the upcoming blue button right there. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Sunday with some Sunday foolishness. We'll see ya.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.